She was in the living room when my son called. I remember the exact moment because I'd just come in from the garage. My hands smelled like motor oil. I'd been trying to fix the lawnmower for the third weekend in a row, and I was wiping them on an old rag when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. My son's name lit up the screen. He never called on Sunday afternoons. He texted like everyone under 40. I picked up. Dad. His voice was strange, tight in a way I hadn't heard since his mother's funeral 6 years ago. Is Sylvia home? I looked through the doorway. My wife was sitting in her chair by the window, the one she always claimed had the best light for reading. She had her book open in her lap. She hadn't turned a page in a while, but she was there, solid and real, the same woman I'd been married to for 31 years. She's right here, I said, in the living room. Why? A pause that lasted too long. Dad, I'm looking at her, right now. She's walking through baggage claim at O'Hare with a man I've never seen before. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just stood there holding the rag, looking at the back of my wife's head. She had her reading glasses on. Her coffee cup was on the side table, still steaming. That's not possible, I said. Dad. His voice dropped lower. I'm standing 20 feet away. I just landed from Denver. I watched her come down the escalator. I took a photo. I'm looking at it right now. I didn't move. I said something about how it must be someone who looked like her, someone who happened to have the same gray-streaked hair, the same blue coat she'd worn every winter for the past 4 years. He said he'd know his own mother. I said I understood that. I said I'd hold him back. I set the phone down on the counter. I stood in the kitchen for a few minutes, not doing anything in particular, just breathing. The refrigerator made that hum it always makes in the afternoon when the compressor kicks on. Through the doorway, my wife shifted in her chair, reached for her coffee without looking up from her book. Her hand found the cup exactly the way it always does. I walked to the doorway. Who called? She asked, not looking up. Wrong number, I said. She nodded and turned a page. My son's name is Patrick. He's 34, works in logistics, flies for work more than he'd like. He has my eyes and his mother's habit of going quiet when something's wrong, which is how I'd known something was wrong before he even said a word. I called him back when I was outside, standing in the driveway, pretending to check the mailbox. Send me the photo, I said. It came through 30 seconds later. The image was a little blurry. He'd taken it quickly, from a distance, trying not to be noticed. But it was clear enough. A woman in a blue coat, dark hair with grey at the temples, the same shade Sylvia had been going since she turned 58. She was walking next to a man in his mid-50s, well-dressed, a carry-on bag rolling behind him. She was laughing at something he'd said. The woman had Sylvia's coat, Sylvia's hair, Sylvia's posture, that way she has of walking with her chin slightly forward, like she's always moving toward something. I zoomed in on her face. I didn't say anything to Patrick for a long moment. Did she see you? I asked. I don't think so. I started walking the other direction when I realized what I was looking at. Good, I said. Don't say anything to her. Don't call the house. I need some time to think. He wanted to talk more. I told him I'd be in touch. I went back inside. My wife and I had been married since 1993. I was 31 when we got married. She was 29. We met at a property tax appeal seminar, which is probably the least romantic origin story you've ever heard, but that's how it happened. She was there representing a small architecture firm she worked for. I was there because I'd just bought a duplex and had no idea what I was doing. She explained the process to me in the parking lot afterward because she'd noticed I was taking notes on a McDonald's napkin. We were both practical people. We raised 2 kids, kept the same house for 23 years, drove sensible cars, put money into our 401ks every year without fail. We didn't have dramatic arguments. We didn't have passionate reconciliations. What we had was a partnership that worked. that was comfortable, that I had never once had reason to doubt. That was the thing that kept coming back to me in the days after Patrick's call. Not anger, not grief, just the disorientation of realizing that I had been measuring something with the wrong instrument for a very long time. I didn't confront her, not right away. I'm a retired accountant, 40 years of auditing other people's numbers, and what I know in my bones, is that you don't walk into a situation like that without your evidence in order. You don't ask questions you're not prepared to hear the answers to. You build the picture first, then you look at it. So that's what I did. The first thing I did was check our joint checking account, not the main one, the secondary account we kept for household expenses, groceries, utilities, the occasional home repair. Sylvia had handled that account for as long as I could remember. I trusted her with it completely. I sat at my desk after she'd gone to bed and opened the online banking portal for the first time in probably 4 years. I started scrolling. The withdrawals had started 14 months ago. Nothing dramatic. She was too smart for that. Never more than $800 at a time, usually less. Grocery store amounts, the kind that don't trigger a second look, but they were frequent. 2, sometimes 3 times a week. Cash withdrawals at ATMs I didn't recognize, in parts of the city I didn't have any reason to think she'd been. I spent 2 hours going through the records. When I was done, I had 14 months of transactions on a legal pad and a number at the bottom that made me set my pen down very carefully. A little over $40,000. I sat with that for a while. The house was quiet. The clock on the wall made its small sound every minute. Down the hall, I could hear the white noise machine Sylvia ran every night because she said she couldn't sleep without it. I had paid for that machine. The next morning I called my daughter. She lives in Portland, teaches high school English. She's 32, practical like me, doesn't panic. I told her I needed her to look into something quietly and not ask me too many questions yet. She agreed, because she knows me well enough to know that if I'm asking for help with something, I've already tried everything else. I told her I needed to know if there was another woman who resembled her mother. A professional. An actress, maybe, or someone her mother might have paid to. I didn't know how to finish the sentence. My daughter was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, are you telling me someone else has been living in your house?" I said I wasn't telling her anything yet. I was asking her to help me figure out what was true. She started making calls that afternoon. Here's what I knew about my wife that year. Looking back, she'd been restless. I hadn't called it that at the time. I'd called it retirement adjustment. She'd left her job at the architecture firm 18 months before this, a buyout, she'd said, an early retirement package. She'd seemed relieved. She'd talked about traveling, about spending time with the grandchildren, about finally learning to make her mother's brisket recipe properly. But she'd also been on her phone more than usual. She'd started going to a Tuesday afternoon yoga class that I'd never thought to question because I'd always taken her at her word. She occasionally had lunch with friends whose names I vaguely recognized. I was wondering what was real and what wasn't. I started paying closer attention. Not in an obvious way. I'm good at being quiet when I need to be. I noticed things. The woman I was living with had Sylvia's walk, Sylvia's mannerisms, the particular way she tilted her head when she was pretending to listen. But she was slightly off in ways I couldn't have quantified at first. She didn't reach for the TV remote with her left hand. Sylvia always used her left hand. This woman used her right. She added oat milk to her coffee. Sylvia had always used half and half. When I mentioned a trip we'd taken to Quebec for our 25th anniversary, she smiled and said, "That was such a good trip," without adding any detail. Sylvia always talked about the cheese shop we'd found on Rue Saint-Jean, the one where the owner had let us sample 6 different kinds, and we'd ended up spending $40 and not regretting a cent. This woman didn't mention the cheese shop. I mentioned it myself, obliquely, a few nights later. I said something about how I'd been thinking about that little shop in Quebec, wondered if it was still there. She smiled and agreed it had been wonderful. She didn't remember the name of the street. My daughter called me back on a Thursday evening, 10 days after Patrick's call. She'd been careful about it. She had a friend who did casting work for small theater productions in Chicago. Not film, not big productions, but the kind of professional work where you kept connections. Her friend had put out a few quiet inquiries. There was a woman, 55, freelance, did corporate work, mainly role-playing exercises for business training, that kind of thing. She'd been hired for a private residential assignment about 14 months ago. The friend wouldn't say more than that, but my daughter had found the woman's agency listing. The woman in the listing had dark hair with gray at the temples. I want to be honest about something. In 31 years of marriage, I was not the most attentive husband. I was faithful. I want to be clear about that. I was always faithful. But I was often distracted. I worked long hours. I thought about work when I wasn't at work. I missed things. I was the kind of man who remembered our anniversary, but sometimes forgot what mattered to her more, that I asked about her day and actually listened to the answer. I don't say this to excuse what she did. What she did was a calculated, organized betrayal that involved hiring another person, draining money from our shared accounts, and letting me live with a stranger for more than a year while she built a different life somewhere else. But I had spent a long time auditing other people's finances and not enough time auditing my own marriage. That was true. I could hold both things at once. I set the trap on a Friday. I told the woman I was living with. I had stopped thinking of her as my wife by this point. That I was going out to run errands and would be back in a couple of hours. I drove to the end of the block, parked, and watched the house. About 40 minutes later, a car pulled up. A man got out, the same build as the man in Patrick's photo. He went inside. He was there for 23 minutes. I sat in my car and watched the clock. When he left, I drove back home and walked in through the garage. She was in the kitchen doing something with her phone. She put it face down on the counter when she heard me come in. "You're back early," she said. "Errand didn't take as long as I thought," I said. I went to wash my hands. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. Then I went back downstairs and sat across from her at the kitchen table. I put my phone between us, face up, with Patrick's photo pulled up. "I'd like to know her name," I said. She looked at the photo for a long time. Then she looked at me, and something shifted in her face. Not guilt exactly, more like the moment when you've been holding a very heavy thing for a long time, and someone finally sees it, and you don't have to pretend it isn't heavy anymore. She told me her name was Brenda. She'd found her through a corporate training company. She told me the assignment had been Brenda's idea, in a sense. Sylvia had explained what she needed, and Brenda had said she could handle it, that she'd done similar work before in what she called transition situations. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't want to know. She told me about the man. His name didn't matter to me. They'd met 2 years ago at a conference in Indianapolis. She'd been there representing a non-profit she'd started volunteering with after the firm buyout. She said she hadn't planned for it to become what it became. She said she knew that didn't matter. I asked her why she hadn't just asked for a divorce. She looked at her hands on the table. "I was afraid," she said, "of what it would mean, of what you would think of me. So instead," I said, "you hired someone to be you." She didn't answer that. "The $40,000, I said. "I'll pay it back." "That's not the point." "I know." We sat there for a while. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, somebody's dog was barking at something in the alley. "Does she know your stories?" I asked. "The ones about your mother, your childhood." She looked up. "The cheese shop in Quebec," I said. She didn't know about the cheese shop. My wife, my actual wife, sitting across from me for the first time in over a year, closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were wet. "I didn't give her that," she said quietly. "I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't entirely." The divorce was final 8 months later. It was as civil as these things can be when both people are past 60 and exhausted and have children watching. We split the house equity. She paid back the $40,000 in monthly installments, as agreed, signed and notarized. I didn't fight over the furniture. I took the toolbox, the good cast-iron skillet, and the framed photo from our first apartment that I'd always liked more than she had. Brenda, for what it's worth, was never in the house during school vacations when the grandchildren came to visit. My wife had apparently drawn one line somewhere, even if she'd crossed every other one. Patrick still doesn't fully understand what happened. He knows the broad outlines. He's angry in the way that sons are angry when they feel their fathers have been wronged, which I appreciate but have tried to redirect. My daughter understands more. She called me a few months after the divorce was final and said, "Dad, I think Mom was just scared." I told her I knew that. I told her knowing it didn't make it simple. "No," she said, "but it makes it human. I live alone now in a smaller place, a 2-bedroom condo about 4 miles from the house. I have a view of the parking lot, which is not romantic, but it's quiet, and the maintenance fee covers the snow removal, which at 63 I've decided is worth paying for. I have a routine. Coffee at 6. A walk before 7 if the weather allows. Breakfast, the news, whatever repair or project I've set myself for the day. My grandchildren come on the second Sunday of every month and we make something together in the kitchen. Waffles, usually, because waffles are forgiving of small mistakes. Sometimes in the early mornings I stand at the kitchen window and watch the light change over the parking lot. It's not the same as standing in a garage smelling like motor oil, hearing the hum of a refrigerator, thinking everything is exactly as it should be. But it's mine, completely and without question mine. That turns out to matter more than I would have expected. You spend a long time measuring things. Budgets, time, expectations, people, and eventually you learn that the most important ledger is the one you keep on yourself. What you paid attention to. What you let slide. What you assumed was solid because you'd never tested it. I'm more careful now about what I assume, and I make very good waffles. I still think about the refrigerator hum. It's a strange thing to fixate on, but that's the detail that stays with me. Standing in the kitchen that Sunday afternoon, phone in one hand, greasy rag in the other, looking through the doorway at a woman in my wife's chair, drinking from my wife's coffee cup, and the refrigerator just humming away like nothing in the world had changed. The ordinary sounds of a life that had already come apart without my knowing. I've spent some time since then trying to understand how it happened, not the logistics of it. I'm an accountant, I figured out the logistics. But the deeper how. How does a man live with someone for over a year and not know? And the honest answer is that I knew the version of my wife I had decided to know. I'd stopped asking questions. I'd stopped being curious about her. I measured our marriage the way I measured everything else, income and outgo, assets and liabilities, balanced at the end of the year. What I hadn't accounted for was the widening gap between what was on the books and what was actually true. That's the thing about integrity. Not the word you put on a resume, but the real thing, the kind that requires you to look honestly at what you've built and ask whether it's sound. I thought I was an honest man. I was honest with numbers. I was honest about facts, but I hadn't been honest about what my marriage had become. Because being honest about it would have required me to admit that I'd been a passive participant in my own life for a very long time. Sylvia was wrong to do what she did. That's not complicated, but I was wrong too, in quieter ways that added up over 31 years. What I'm prouder of is what I did when the ground shifted. I didn't panic. I didn't confront without evidence. I didn't let shame or anger make the decisions for me. I sat with the discomfort. I gathered the picture before I asked anyone to look at it. That kind of clear-headedness, the ability to reason carefully when everything in you wants to react, that's something you develop slowly over a lifetime. And it turns out it matters in places you never expected it to matter. And then there was the getting through it. The divorce, the smaller apartment, the Sunday mornings alone, the recalibration of what a good day looks like when it belongs entirely to you. That part was hard in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'm 63 years old and I was learning, for the first time, how to be accountable only to myself. How to build a routine that had meaning without anyone else in it to validate it. How to keep going on days when keeping going felt like the least interesting option available. Patrick is still a little angry on my behalf. My daughter understands more than she lets on. The grandchildren come on the second Sunday of every month, and we make waffles, and they don't know anything about any of this. And I'd like to keep it that way for a while longer. I measure differently now, not just numbers. I try to measure attention, how much of it I'm giving to the people and things that matter, and how much I'm letting slide because it's easier not to look. I don't always get it right, but I know now what it costs when you stop looking altogether. The refrigerator still hums. It does that everywhere you live, eventually. The question is what you're paying attention to while it does.